Gotta readjust this camera. Just give another minute before we actually start. Oh, you don't like looking at the camera? Okay, I'll move it back. Maybe that's just comfort. Get another shot. Up here. Old cat. Old lady. So. Anyway. Hello and welcome to the streaming Parson Reads, the Book of Acts. And today we are continuing on our Bible study throughout the Book of Acts, and we'll be reading chapters 13 and 14 today. I encourage you guys to follow along. I will be using the New International Version. But before we start, we'll just lead off with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll do our preface. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. And we thank you for this time that we have to continue reading through your word. And I just pray that as we read through your word today, that you would continue to inspire us and to show us what it means to be followers of you and how to be faithful. I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. All right, so chapters 13 and 14 of the Book of Acts. This is one of the big turning points of the Acts narrative. And what I mean by that is the focus of the Book of Acts drastically changes. So, as I talked about last week, the first 12 chapters was kind of talking about this idea of Christianity becoming a movement. And as a movement, it would have this kind of cultural influence and impact in the culture that it is birthed from, which is how most movements occur. And so, at first, Christianity started out as this kind of Jewish cult. And the main conflict was how Christianity would become something more than that. And so, as we read through the chapters, one of the revolutionary ideas, which, to be fair, other parts of the Bible hint at this, but unfortunately, nothing really came out of it. And so, for instance, there's a theme throughout the Old Testament about how God would bring salvation to the Jews and to those outside of the Jews, aka the Gentiles, aka everybody else. But unfortunately, history tells us that nothing really came out of that idea. And unfortunately, just like with any other human being, with any other set of human beings, Christians would, or sorry, not Christians, Jews would eventually fall into a very, how do I put it? Ethno-binding kind of aspect to their religion. So what I mean by that, and I elaborated on this quite a bit 2 weeks ago, so you can go watch that stream to get caught up on this idea. But basically, for the longest time, and in most other cultures and religions, religion was generally tied up to a national identity. And so Judaism is a very clear example of this. I mean, it's in the name, right? So it had a very strong tie to the Jewish identity. And so because religion generally functioned this way, there was no reason for Judaism to expand to other religion, or sorry, not to other ethnic groups. And before people start talking about how like Judaism and the Bible is so oppressive, they're not the only people guilty of this. Basically, every other religion, with the exception of Buddhism, but Buddhism is the exception because Buddhism was a breakaway from Indian traditions, and so I mean, if you wanted to make parallels with Buddhism and Christianity, one of the parallels would be that they were breaking off from the preceding religion and their preceding mindsets. But Buddhism is like the only exception I can think of. Every other religion is closely tied to a national identity. But Christianity was revolutionary, at least in the Middle East anyway, because it tried to break away from that. It tried to break away from just being tied down to a particular national identity. And of course, the early Christians would have thought like, yeah, this should be the case because Jesus told us to make disciples of all nations. And so, you can't have both. You can't have an ethno binding religion and also go out and make disciples of all nations. Those two things don't exactly work very well together. And so as we reach the later part of this first arc in the book of Acts, and we get to chapters 10, 11, 12, Christianity has expanded far beyond the Jewish walls. And part of that was helped by, ironically enough, the persecution of the earliest believers in Jerusalem after the martyr of Stephen. Because, of course, a bunch of Jewish believers were like, we're getting the hell out of here. And so they went to various places throughout the Roman Empire, and they would naturally continue talking about Jesus even well after they left, which does add strength to the claims of Christianity, because I'm going kind of backwards in the narrative here, but when you read in chapters like chapters 4, I think it's chapter 4, where there was a Jewish priest, a rabbi, who was talking about how, well, if this is just like every other like false messiah claim, then it would just die off like the rest of them. These claims made by these Christ professors. And so the fact that even after the early Christians were being persecuted, they were still proclaiming the gospel, because of course they strongly believed in the message of the gospel, the resurrection life of Jesus, and so on. And so that was another way of which Christianity was expanding beyond just Jerusalem and being more than an ethno-binding religion like many other religions. And so I know that's a very long explanation, or rather me condensing a very long explanation. And 2 weeks ago I used that whole like American comic book illustration to talk about how like a good example of modern ethno-binding ideas and ethno-binding religion in North America, American culture, is the superhero comic. And the reason why the superhero comic back then, blew up like it did was because it reestablished a monomyth for the American culture. Because, of course, when America was a thing, the idea of America would be that it would be a melting pot of different cultures, and that included different religions. But a natural consequence of that is America is not united under a single religion. And so the superhero comic book was created to kind of fill that gap and create a national narrative. And of course, in olden days of comic books, the values of which the superheroes were very monolithic because they wanted to create an American identity through it. And so the point I was getting with that illustration was that this is the ethno-binding religious mindset is something that humans are just overly used to. Because at the same time, when you create things like national identity, for instance, well, one, that makes your country stronger, because then you have people willing to fight for it, because people then tie their identity to their home, to the land they live in. And so there's stuff like that. But one of the antithetical elements of Christianity is that Christianity tries to disregard that and say that, well, everyone believes in Jesus because we're all human. And so Christianity tries to break away from this, looking at the ethno-binding aspects of religion, and tries to appeal to something more broad within the human being. But of course, it's a two-way street. So on the one hand, Christianity would make sense for it to be very appealing, because it draws all people under a single unifying idea that all human beings need forgiveness from God. And the person of God, if you will, is Jesus Christ. And so that you can bring everyone together under a single umbrella in that sense. But on the other hand, you run into the problem with that is it does erode away at creating diversity, if you will. And so human beings are naturally opposed to this kind of melting pot assimilation. They're opposed to that, because when you have your distinct elements within diversity, that is how people primarily build identity. And so, personal identity, rather. And so, to TLDR that, basically, people find problems with Christianity because, then I'm no longer really my own person. I'm just another, drone of the Christian, thinking, is kind of how the modern critic would view it, and hence why there's pushback against Christianity. An example I use to back this kind of idea up is how, for instance, in Japanese culture, especially in feudal Japan, and this idea still lingers on today, where the Japanese tradition, you hold that very high esteem, and so you do whatever you can to keep the tradition. And so you can't have these these Middle Easterns start telling you that, no, you don't need to hold on to tradition. There is something that binds all human beings instead of your individual tradition. and Japanese people are very much in their ways. You know, and I made the whole joke about like why Nintendo acts stingy like it does, and Nintendo doesn't get with the times at times, is because of that mindset. And so it's just one of those things that Christianity will always run into that trouble, because Christianity is trying to try to break down and even erode away at traditionalism. But human beings for millennia maintain identity through traditionalism. And so you got kind of a problem here. And so the Bible tells this kind of story from within the Jewish people, because there were Jews that were trying to maintain a Jewish tradition while still being Christian, but then that gets challenged. So this is where Peter meets Cornelius, which, first of all, it's looked down upon if like Jewish men visit the homes of Gentiles, but Peter does it anyway. And then of course, with the implication of that is, well, you probably ate some, not kosher food, stuff that's not okay. It's one of those things that, like, once again, in our modern era, we don't think about this very much, because, like, oh, okay, especially in my case, like, I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, like, it's a place known for having, like, diversity when it comes to, like, eating, for instance. I can eat whatever I want here, and it's freaking awesome. That's why Vancouver's awesome, and why, despite everything being overly expensive, at the same time, I love living here, because, like, one of the reasons is I can eat whatever I want here. Nothing is out of reach, because Vancouver has all kinds of people from all over the world. And outside of, like, the native countries themselves, you're not going to, outside of Japan for sushi, or outside of, Hong Kong for traditional Chinese food, outside of Iraq for the best donair, like, everything's here. And so in Vancouver, if you live in Vancouver 2022, like yours truly, you normally don't think about, like, oh, how even your dietary habits portray your cultural identity. Because once again, like, in Vancouver, it's just like, screw that, I eat whatever I want. So it's kind of that mindset. But that was something that in the Book of Acts, some of the Jews had to overcome this, because they're still kind of thinking, like, no, I still eat, like, Jewish kosher. But then Jesus kind of says, no, you don't have to. You're free to be. You are free from binding things like that, because faith is not about this kind of ethno-binding identity, but rather it is about trust in Jesus Christ ultimately. And so that was something that the Christians had to kind of deal with. But at the same time, as they wrestle with this, it kind of brings a little bit of clarity in the mission. And the mission is to, what did Jesus tell them in the book of Matthew? Go out, go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and so on. And so, in order to really pursue that, which is a direct command from Jesus, if you think about it, you had to drop some of the traditionalist mindset. But with this overcoming of that traditionalist mindset, the Acts narrative transitions from focusing on the centralized Jerusalem church, and it moves to the story of a missionary, and how this missionary will go to Gentile areas, non-Jewish people, and bring believers from all parts, well, not all parts of the world, obviously, because travel didn't exist the way that we have it today, but you get the idea. We have this guy here, Saul of Tarsus, from chapter 9, who used to be a terrorist, is now going to spread the gospel to Gentiles all over the place. And so that's kind of where we are now in the story, and the narrative shift changes quite a bit, because once again, the earlier stuff was more talking about like kind of like an overview of like church history, if you will, in the first century. But now we move to the story of a missionary, and so um, how do I put this? The style of the narrative changes a little bit too. And this is where I bring this up because I know some people they would some Bible critics would talk about how the narrative within the Book of Acts is not consistent, and so it could very well have multiple writers and stuff like that. And when you have multiple writers writing the same thing, some people use that as evidence to kind of push back on the validity of the document. Nor that doesn't really matter, one, for starters, and two, I think you miss the point of what the story itself is saying when you get too caught up in like the details like that, and how you think details may ruin a text's particular validity. But rather, the Occam's razor way of viewing it is that the story within Acts is changed. The focus changes to talking about a story of a particular missionary. And so the style of the Book of Acts will shift that way. It's no longer talking about Christianity as the movement, but rather we're talking about a particular missionary. And that's the point of the story at this point. I know that was a super long preface, but I kind of needed to do that whole review, because the book, chapter 13, will be very different from all the other stuff we just read earlier. But before that, we're actually going to start in chapter 12, verse 25, which is like, what, the verse before chapter 13. So we're going to start now, basically. But I am starting a verse before chapter 13 starts. So when Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. Chapter 13. Now in the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and sent them off. Now the two of them, sent on their way by the Holy Spirit, went down to Seleucia and sailed there to Cyprus. When they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogues. John was with them as their helper. So Saul and Barnabas traveled through the whole island until they came to Paphos, where they met a Jewish sorcerer and false prophet named Bar-Jesus, who was an attendant of the proconsul Sergius Paulus. The proconsul, an intelligent man, sent for Barnabas and Saul because he wanted to hear the word of God. But Elymas, the sorcerer, opposed them and tried to turn the proconsul from the faith. Then Saul, who was also called Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked straight at Elymas and said, "You are a child of the devil and an enemy of everything that is right. You are full of all kinds of deceit and trickery. Will you never stop perverting the right ways of the Lord? Now the hand of the Lord is against you, and you are going to be blind for a time, not even able to see the light of the sun." Immediately, mist and darkness came over him, and he groped about, seeking someone to lead him by the hand. When the proconsul saw what had happened, he believed, for he was amazed at the teaching about the Lord. Now from Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. From Perga, they went on to Pisidian, Antioch, a different Antioch, basically. On the Sabbath, they entered the synagogue and sat down. After reading the law and the prophets, the leaders of the synagogue sent word to them, saying, "Brothers, if you have a word of exhortation for the people, please speak." Standing up, Paul motioned with his hand and said, "Fellow Israelites, and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me. The God of the people of Israel chose our ancestors. He made the people prosper during their stay in Egypt. With mighty power, he led them out of the country. And for about 40 years he endured their conduct in the wilderness, and he overthrew 7 nations in Canaan, giving their land to his people as their inheritance. And all of this took about 450 years. Now after this, God gave them judges until the time of Samuel the prophet. Then the people asked for a king, and he gave them Saul, the son of Kish, who ruled for 40 years. After removing Saul, he made David their king. And God testified concerning him, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. He will do everything I want him to do." Now from this man's descendants, God brought to Israel the Savior Jesus, as he promised. Before the coming of Jesus, John the Baptist preached repentance and baptism to all the people of Israel. And as John was completing his work, he said, "Who do you suppose I am? I am not the one you are looking for, but there is one coming after me, whose sandals I am unworthy to tie." Fellow children of Abraham, and you God-fearing Gentiles, it is us that this message of salvation has been sent. The people of Jerusalem and their rulers did not recognize Jesus. Yet in condemning him, they fulfilled the words of the prophets that they read every Sabbath. Though they found no proper ground for a death sentence, they had Pontius Pilate have him executed. When they had carried out all that was written about him, they took him down from the cross and laid him in a tomb. But God raised him from the dead, and for many days he was seen by those who had traveled with him from Galilee to Jerusalem. They are now his witnesses to our people. Now we tell you the good news. What God promised our ancestors, he has fulfilled for us, their children, by raising up Jesus, as it is written in the 2nd Psalm. "You are my son, and today I have become your father." Now God raised him from the dead so that he would never be subject to decay, as God has said, "I will give you the holy and sure blessings promised to David." And so it is also stated elsewhere, "You will not let your Holy One see decay." So now, when David had served God's purpose in his own generation, he fell asleep, and was buried with his ancestors, and his body decayed. But the one whom God raised from the dead did not see decay. Therefore, my friends, I want you to know that through Jesus, the forgiveness of sins is proclaimed to you. Through him, everyone who believes is set free from every sin, a justification you were not able to obtain under the law of Moses. Now take care what the prophets have said does not happen to you. Oh, look, you scoffers, wonder and perish, for I am going to do something in your days that you would never believe, even if someone told you. As Paul and Barnabas were leaving the synagogue, the people invited them to speak further about these things on the next Sabbath. When the congregation was dismissed, many of the Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who talked with them and urged them to continue in the grace of God. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. When the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy, and they began to contradict what Paul was saying and heaped abuse on him. When Paul and Barnabas answered them boldly, "We speak the word of God to you first, and since you reject it and do not consider yourselves worthy of eternal life, we now turn to the Gentiles. For this is what the Lord has commanded us. I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth." When the Gentiles heard this, they were glad and honored the word of they were glad and honored the word of the Lord, and all who were appointed for eternal life believed. Now the word of the Lord spread through the whole region, but the Jewish leaders incited the God-fearing women of high standing and leading men of the city. They stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them from their region. So they shook the dust off their feet as a warning to them and went to Iconium. And the disciples were filled with joy and with the Holy Spirit. Okay, so chapter 13, even though there's a lot being said, a lot of it is more like Paul just retelling the Old Testament. Because, of course, once again, even though Christianity broke away from tradition, as I talked about in length earlier, there were still strong ties to the Old Testament. After all, Jesus saw himself as the fulfillment of all the prophecies in the Old Testament. And so you can't disregard the Old Testament when you're talking about how Jesus is the Savior of the world. It doesn't really work to do that. And so there's a lot of Paul just summarizing, parts of the Old Testament. Because, of course, that's kind of how you would do things when you're talking about the gospel. You would talk about all the stuff God promised in the Old Testament, and then the matter of fact is that Jesus is the fulfillment of those things. Jesus is the actualization of those promises. Which, once again, is why the resurrection is, core to the Christian belief, as Paul, rightly says. It is in Jesus that we are given salvation, and it is Him that we now have life. In Him there is no decay, etc., etc. And so stuff like that, I'm just kind of, I just gave you those notes when you think about all the Old Testament references that Paul mentions, because he quotes quite a few of them. He quotes like the book of Habakkuk. He quotes Isaiah, obviously. He says he quotes from Psalm 2. He quotes, I think it's mainly just Isaiah and Habakkuk, really. And so Paul is making the point that, like, yes, Jesus is the fulfillment of these old prophecies. Because, of course, how would, your typical synagogue gathering go down, right? It's about the constant expectation of the Messiah. And so in these areas where, a little further out, not so close to the homeland, if you will, they were still, they didn't really have like the John the Baptist phenomenon even happen. And so they're probably just, every synagogue meeting would be about like, okay, we read these passages, these scrolls, and think about how how could God fulfill these promises? That's probably how every synagogue Sabbath meeting would go down. But what Paul tells these people in Iconium, in Pisidia, not Iconium, we're not there yet. In Pisidian, he tells them all these things that you're reading about. Jesus, Jesus is the manifestation of that, and to be saved, you need to believe in him. And so that's kind of the gist of chapter 13. And what's neat is that many people come to believe in Pisidian, which is interesting because, we read in earlier chapters that there was still quite a bit of resistance from primarily like the Jewish people, who would have known about John the Baptist, who would have known about Jesus. But you have these guys out here in parts of Seleucia, which, if you don't know what that is, Seleucia was basically it. So I got to do a little bit of geography history here. So after Alexander the Great basically kicked the shit out of a whole bunch of people and claimed a lot of the world, after he died, well, about 100 years after he died, the land that was the Greek Empire, technically is more Macedonian Empire because he was from Macedon, a subsect of the Greek people. But anyway, the Greek Empire was essentially divided up into 4 groups based on 4 different families. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but one of them was a dude named Seleucia. And of course, the Middle East, a fair amount of the Middle East was in that part. Like Seleucia claimed a lot of the Middle Eastern part of what Alexander took over. And so, it says Paul did leave, what would be Canaan, but he doesn't go that far, right? Because Seleucia wouldn't, Seleucia is a pretty big place. And so when he gets to Pisidian Antioch, he wouldn't be that far. He'd probably be just what would be just north of Iraq? Northwest, I guess. Not too far. I don't think it's Syria. Syria's a little bit more west. But you get the idea. While Paul may be outside of Canaan, he's not that far, but the fact that he travels that far and that there are Jewish believers as well as Gentile God-fearers, as they're referred to as. Because once again, one of the interesting things is that you couldn't be a Gentile Jew. That doesn't really work, because, as I mentioned about the whole ethno-binding identity of ethno-binding religion idea, even if you believed in the God of Israel but you weren't Jewish, you wouldn't be considered Jewish. You wouldn't be a Jew just because you believed, and we'll run into some of the chapters that talk about this in great detail, but it was more than just believing in God kind of thing. But you also had to conform to Jewish tradition in order to be a Jew. And so that's why in the book of Acts they refer to it just as God-fearing Greeks or God-fearing Gentiles or whatever. Because even though they believed in the God of Israel, they would not be considered Jewish because they did not participate in Jewish traditions, such as eating kosher, being circumcised. I'm sure there are other things, but those are the first 2 that come to mind. Their dress attire, obviously. And so, in a weird way, I don't know how to word this very well, but basically, even if you believed in the God of Israel and you weren't Jewish, you were kind of viewed as a second class within the religion. But Christianity said, no, it's not the case. It's just merely faith in Jesus. And so it makes sense that as they move further out from Jerusalem, and you have these God-fearing Gentiles, well, they would be pretty receptive quickly, because one of the major obstacles that these guys likely faced was, I want to believe in the God of Israel, but at the same time, I have to take quite a cut, if you will, in that I will be viewed as second class. But at the same time, the rationale would be, but we're supposed to, but at the same time, I guess it's not that bad to be treated second class if I'm believing in the true God. So I guess I'll just take my lumps. But I know the problem with that would be, well, that seems kind of unfair. And it is unfair, which is why when Paul talks about salvation in the person of Jesus and coming to faith in Jesus, that eliminates that problem because Jesus is for all people. And so it's to no surprise that all these believers would then convert to Christianity, and Christianity starts really expanding. And that's why when you look at it from like how Christianity has changed in the world today, you'll find a lot more non-Jewish Christians than you'll find Jewish Christians. Because on the one hand, it's like, well, the God of Israel is the true God, but I also want to be treated like an equal. And so you can't really fall into Judaism in that sense. Like, it'd be tough for a Chinese guy like yours truly to be Jewish, because the ethno-binding elements of Judaism would work against me. They would work against me. And so that would be a big turnoff, even though it's like, well, I want to believe in the real, in the one true God kind of thing. But that would be a big, resistance, if you will, to bringing converts. And now you kind of see the problem more applicably. But as Paul talks about, it is merely faith in Jesus, come to belief in him and be forgiven of your sins. This is something that's an invitation to all people. And so that's why you can have people from all different parts of the world all be Christian, and they're all treated as equal in the Christian circle. At least ideally they're supposed to be. Unfortunately, injustice has its little, slivers everywhere. But the idea is that Christianity is for all people, and it does not differentiate or show favoritism among anyone. A few other literary things to kind of take note of. So once again, we have John Mark, and he is not the same John as the writer of John. So John Mark is an interesting character. I want to talk about a little bit, because he actually plays a very big role in the Christian world outside of the book of Acts. So I kind of want to talk about, but I won't talk about everything about him because he does come back in the story. We'll talk about him more then. But basically, John Mark, he must have been someone close to like the apostles. He must have been someone that it is very likely that John Mark was one of like the earliest followers of Jesus. So as I mentioned in the book of Luke readings, Jesus didn't just have 12 disciples. He had way more than that, actually. The 12 were just kind of like an inner circle. And then even within the inner circle, Peter, James, and a different John, so James and John, when we say James and John, I'll refer to them as the Zebedee brothers. So the Zebedee brothers and Peter were like even closer to Jesus within the inner circle. And then the rest of the apostles were part of this inner circle. But Jesus had other followers. He had, like, for example, Mary and Martha. And I make jokes about this all the freaking time. Why do you have two sisters with the same freaking name? Why? What parent just does that? What parent does that? But anyway, Mary and Martha were followers of Jesus. So obviously Jesus had more than 12 followers. Their older brother Lazarus, who Jesus raises from the dead in the book of John. There were some other Marys, because everybody's named Mary in the Bible. So there are other Marys that visit Jesus' tomb when he died. So Jesus had other followers. There was the Joseph of Arimathea guy, who was the one who gave Jesus the tomb, rather, after he died. So he was obviously a follower. And there were other people. And so John Mark, not Zebedee, John Mark would have been one of these followers. Oh yeah, not to mention, I totally forgot to mention Justus and Matthias. And Matthias gets promoted to take Judas's place in the inner circle. So Jesus had a bunch of other disciples. And John Mark was likely one of these disciples from like the earliest days. and he would have been pretty close. He was pretty close to the inner circle, because something that a lot of people, unless you're like unless a Bible scholar like yours truly tells you, you wouldn't know that the Book of Mark was written by this guy named John Mark. And a little fun fact, actually, that many people tend to forget, and why other books, quote unquote, not included in the Bible, is like, well, what about the Gospel according to Peter? It's like, it does exist, and it does exist in the Bible. Actually, people don't know that. A little bit of trivia. Not the Book of Peter that's found in the Second Apocrypha, but there actually is a Book of Peter. It's called the Book of Mark. And a little bit of church history, and according to some Orthodox traditions, after John Mark and Paul settle things, and this is where, like, once again, we'll come to this later in the story. There's a little bit of tension between them, Paul and John Mark. And after that actually gets resolved in sometime during like near the end of Paul's life, there's resolve between them, and at that when that happens during that time period, if you will, John Mark is actually Peter's secretary, basically. And so it is very likely that all the stuff that was written by Peter, and this is where a lot of people like go, well, how could Peter have written first, second, and third Peter when Peter was just an illiterate fisherman? That's what secretaries are for. And so John Mark would have been that guy. So in a way, John Mark is the actual writer of the letters of Peter and the writer of Mark, aka the Gospel of Peter. Just a little bit of fun trivia. But that's why the book of Acts brings him up here, because he is actually important. I mean, yeah, we met him earlier when all the disciples were praying at his house when Peter was in prison. But I think this guy is John Mark is overlooked quite a bit, because he is actually a big impact to the biblical narrative. I mean, he's the guy who wrote the book of Mark, and he's also arguably the writer of First, Second, and Third Peter, because Peter was illiterate. So while Peter may have said stuff, Mark wrote it down. So that technically makes him the writer. So just a little interesting trivia about that. I will come back to the whole tension between Paul and John Mark. That the book of Acts goes over it, but you actually don't see a lot of it. And what you also don't see, which is one of those things that you just got to deal with when you're dealing with like just text, like the Bible, is that you don't get to see, the day-to-day interactions, and you don't get to see how Paul and John Mark make up, because they actually do have like some tension between them. The book of Acts tells you how the tension begins, although it's not brought up in detail. And once again, I'll come back to this when it's relevant again. But when John Mark, after Paul and Barnabas do missionary work in Cyprus with the sorcerer, we'll get to him in a minute, John Mark leaves the party, and then that probably pissed off Paul quite a bit, which leads to some tension that happens between Paul and John Mark. So that's something I want you to keep in mind. I will bring this up again when it's relevant, a little bit later. There's like a few chapters. Like, we're not going to cover it this week, obviously, but in a couple of weeks, I think it's next week's stream we'll have it, because I think it's chapter 16 that it comes up. But I just want you to keep John Mark in your mind, because he is actually a very important character, even though he doesn't do all that much in the story itself. But he is an important figure throughout the New Testament. And so it's very important to keep him in mind here, even though, once again, his role in the book of Acts itself is quite small. His role throughout the entire New Testament is actually a pretty big one. I think John Mark is an interesting character because of that. The other interesting thing the other little story here in chapter 13 is the story where Paul meets this sorcerer named Elymas Bar Jesus. which is, I mean, that's an interesting name. And of course, there's a symbolism thing going on here. So the name Bar Jesus, well, Bar means son, and well, Jesus, obviously. So his name is basically like Jesus' son. But, just roll with it. Little bit of trivia. Anytime like a bar something shows up, you're supposed to read it like a name similar to like Johnson or something. As a matter of fact, I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago, and I made the joke that Saint Peter's name is technically Simon Bar Jonas. Well, his real name is Simon Bar Jonas, and so the Bar Jonas part you're supposed to read if you were to modernly translate that, or you convert it to an English name, I should say. You convert Bar Jonas to an English name, it would translate to something like Johnson, because Jonah is another John name, right? So his name would be Johnson or something like that, or Jonason. But we'll say Johnson, and Peter's first name is actually Simon. Everybody's name's Simon. So anyway, the joke that I kind of make about Saint Peter is that if he were alive today, and we were to call him an English name, his name would be like Simon, and then like a nickname would be Rocky, which is what Petra, the thing Jesus calls him, which is where we get the name Peter. Petra would translate to something like Rocky, and then his last name would be Johnson. So his name would be Simon Rocky Johnson. I know now he doesn't seem that interesting. Now that you think about it that way, it's like, oh, I thought he had an epic name. It's like, nah, his name is just Simon Johnson. Pope Rocky. Yeah, not half as cool anymore. But anyway, back to Bar Jesus here. You're supposed to read it as like Jesus' son or Joshua's son or something. I don't think that's a real name, but just roll with it. So the symbolism here is that, the son of Jesus idea and this whole like lineage of power. And this was also true with Barabbas that we read in the book of Luke. When you're called son of God, you have this kind of lineage of power. But then the Bible kind of turns this on its head and says, well, no, only any real power comes from God and God alone. Not through, you don't, just because you have a wicked ass name doesn't mean you have right to power. And so you have Elymas Bar Jesus here, and he's very self-interested. He cares about his reputation. And so he's doing whatever he can to maintain favor with the proconsul. Because the proconsul is kind of like, oh, I'm curious about this thing you call Christianity. Why don't you tell me about it? And and Elymas probably figures that, like, well, if the proconsul becomes a Christian, then he has no use for someone like me who is not a Christian and is telling him bullshit, basically. And so he tries to get in Paul's way. And it's interesting because when Paul like condemns him and then speaks basically a curse on him, it's funny because he gets afflicted the way Paul does, but the way about it is kind of different, which is very strange. The story is very strange with this, and it's one of those things that I couldn't give you a straight answer for, of why this story of blindness is different from what happens with Paul in chapter 9. And there's obviously that parallel there. That Paul is blinded by the power of God, and Bar Jesus here is also blinded by the power of God. But the way of which they are blinded is very different, and the significance of it is quite different. So in chapter 9, when Paul was blinded, oh, by the way, I'll be referring to Saul of Tarsus as Paul from now on, basically, because it's just easier to call him that. Anyway, when Paul was blinded in chapter 9, the way the Bible describes his blinding, if you will, is that he's overcome with light. Jesus shows up, and then like, because Jesus is so full of light, it blinds Paul. He is blinded by the light of Jesus. And so it's light that causes Paul's blindness, which then comes off like scales, as you read at the end of, or later in chapter 9, when Ananias prays for him. But when Bar Jesus is blinded, it's portrayed very differently. It's portrayed as like darkness comes over him, and this shroud blocks him. And so I couldn't give you a straight answer, because I actually don't have one, of why the Bible decides to tell two different blinding events and describe them so differently. I don't know, it's just very weird to me. It's a very interesting observation to make, but I couldn't give you a straight answer. Many a theologian have tried to give straight answers, but the fact of the matter is no one can really come up with one. We can all of us can come up with our own theories. I could give you my theory if you want, but the fact of the matter is, it's just a very strange occurrence in the Bible that we would have two blinding stories, but they're both very different in nature, and the significances of them are different. So in the case of Paul, he's just overcome with light. Whereas God allows darkness to take hold of Elymas's life. And it's very weird. It's very weird that this would happen, because you would think, the reason why it's weird, at least in my mind, is that you would think that, well, if God wanted to bring Elymas into, the faith, then maybe he would reveal himself to him, and then he would have the light blinding effect. And then after some prayer, that would change. You would think that would be how God would do it with him. But the theory, and I'm not the only one with this theory, it's not my theory, it is a common theory among Bible scholars why Elymas's blindness is portrayed with darkness, is that since Elymas himself wanted to basically put blinders on the proconsul, in a sense, by like trying to lead him astray from believing what Paul was teaching him, then it's a twist of irony that you are planning to put like darkness over someone's eyes. So God kind of playing like a haha irony, karma comes and bites you in the ass kind of thing. You try to put darkness over someone's eyes, I will put darkness over yours. And so maybe that's why the Elymas one is different. Whereas in Paul's case, when Jesus appears to him as light, it is the blindness is a side effect of encountering Jesus. The blindness is a side effect. And of course, the context of that is that it would make sense for that to happen to Paul, because, in his quote-unquote devoted Jewish thinking, well, if you read the book of Exodus, that's how a devoted Jew would have thought of encountering God. That he is so holy, it would destroy you. And so the blindness was a metaphor of that when Paul was blinded. I don't know, that's just my theory of why the two blinding stories work. Or not my theory, it is the common theory. I'm not the only one who thinks this. But at the same time, it's a good theory, but at the same time, I'm not going to say it's a direct answer, because the Bible doesn't tell us why exactly it's this way. The theory is a good theory, and I'm going to stick with that theory. I think the theory is very sound. My logic is sound. So it makes sense. And I have scripture to back up my theory, so I think it's a good theory. So I'm going to stick with it. But at the same time, I'm not going to say it's the definitive answer either. So, but I do want to point out the observation, because I do find it very interesting that the blinding effect here is different. And it is worth noting. Because I know some people may push back and say, well, why would God use darkness? I thought God is light. He doesn't use darkness to do anything. Well, it's like, well, at the same time, like, Book of Exodus. He rides a black cloud. Wouldn't he ride a white cloud if he was only light? And so it's kind of weird that God just does stuff like that. And once again, I couldn't give you a straight answer, but it is worth noting because you don't want to get caught up in just thinking one thing that ends up being wrong. And so I don't know, it's just an interesting observation I wanted to make. Yeah, that's basically it. Well, I guess we could talk about the effects of, well, now we have to jump back and forward at the same time to when Paul is in Pisidian, and he's actually very successful in his missionary trip, which I guess we should talk about that quite a bit, because it's one of those funny things where the average Christian today struggles with like, oh man, it'd be awesome if like I could just convert hundreds of people in a single day kind of thing, and that would be awesome and all, but that's not how things happen. But it is funny to read when you read like here in the book of Acts that that's the kind of thing that's happening. Oh, excuse me. Paul preaches once in Pisidian, and boom, like tons of people are coming to faith. And of course, the irony, one of the big ironies of Christianity's legacy, if you will, is that it started out as a Jewish cult, but it's always Jewish people rejecting it, and then that's why it spread so vastly in the Gentile world, because once again, even though there's a whole thing about like how salvation is to the Jews first and then to the Gentiles, it is more Gentiles who are being saved, because oddly enough, a lot of Jewish people are rejecting. And, part of it is that whole like ethno-binding, religious mindset that I talked about in depth earlier. But it's kind of interesting that like, yes, the Gentile world is very receptive of the gospel. And I think part of my theory behind that, well, it's not so much a theory, it's just like a contingency of logic, I guess I could say. So it's not really a theory, it's just like, what I mean by contingency of logic is that the Bible implies this. However, since the Bible never flat out says it, I won't make the claim that the Bible is saying this. But rather, since the Bible implies it, and you can logically, using what the Bible implies, you can logically think this. So that's what I mean by a logical contingency. So the logical contingency of why a lot of Gentiles would become believers is because, a lot of these Gentiles probably been doing their own religious thing for who knows how long. And they don't feel the power of God. And of course, the Bible would tell you that, like, well, of course, idols are just stone and wood. What power do they have? And of course, there's that one passage in, like, Isaiah that makes fun of idol makers, talk about how, like, yes, a man takes a block of wood, cuts it in half, uses one half of it to light a fire, and the other half he turns it to a god. Like, you're a dumbass, is basically what Isaiah is saying. It's actually hilarious. And so, stuff like that. And many a Gentile, lived that lifestyle for a long ass time. So, after generations, eventually people are like, hey, this God of Israel and the stuff that he does. And it is linked to Jewish history, more so than, like, say, the Greek mythology and how it directly affects Greek people. It's not the same. Whereas, once again, among the Israelites, they would have been like, no, we exist because God freed us from Egypt. Like, we would not be here. And so, and of course, people could, read history and figure that out. And so, maybe a lot of people figure that, like, oh yeah, this God of Israel, he must be the real deal. I mean, he's more than a block of wood, at least. even if he may not be like our philosophy may pan out who God is. You know, almighty and all that stuff. At least he's the real deal. You know, that's probably what the average Greek thinker would be thinking. And so, well, that may very well be the reason why there were a lot of God-fearing Gentiles by the time Paul gets to Pisidian. But then, of course, you know, that's not enough. You know, that's not enough. And understandably, it isn't. And that's why, you know, the message of Jesus Christ is so important, because it's like, well, you know, so what if God is powerful enough to deliver people from another country, whatever? There will always be a bigger enemy. Well, who is the biggest enemy? Death itself. And so, once again, you know, the reason why the resurrection is the most important doctrine is that what makes Jesus stand out is that he is the one who's able to overcome death. And so by transitive properties, I guess that makes him God. Just like how the book of Daniel, you know, portrays the Son of Man, and, you know, the Ancient of Days calls him God because of that purpose in mind. That it would be the Son of Man who rises from the dead. And so, you know, that kind of transient of logic exists, and, you know, these God-fearing Gentiles probably figured that out, and we're like, oh yeah, you know, like, we want to know who this is. And that's where, like, Paul gives a message, like, well, it's Jesus Christ, descendant of David, who did this, who rose from the dead, and that is the person which our faith is built upon, and so on and so on. And so all these Gentiles, and of course Pisidian would be majority Gentile, so all these Gentiles start showing up. And the funny thing, the Bible tells us that, like, oh, you know, the whole ass town starts showing up. I mean, maybe not literally the whole town, but you get the idea. Like, a huge crowd, a bulk of the people here are starting to show up. And, you know, this Christianity movement is more than just a movement. It's not just some Jewish movement anymore. It is a thing that changes cities. And I think that's kind of the major theme that we kind of run with at this point, is that it's not just some Jewish movement. Christianity is a power that changes cities. And Pisidia is the first one shown to be, like, going through major changes. And then, of course, one of the ironies of the story is that, like, who are the ones who actually give the most pushback to the growth of Christianity is Jewish people. Because once again, there's that whole ethno-binding thing, which is why they reject Christianity so much. And so they're the ones that are going to be proactively resisting, you know, all these second class Jews. You know, and then, you know, that's another reason why the Jewish people in Pisidia would also be trying to contradict Paul, as the scripture says, is because they don't want to lose that position over the Gentiles as well. Because if you have Gentiles saying that, like, oh, you know, I want to encounter the real deal with the God of Israel, but then also be treated like a second like. But then for the Jewish people to be like, oh no, that's not something you can directly access. We Jews can do that, and we gotta do it for you. And this is where, once again, there's, like, that whole controversy with, like, how the Catholic Church does things, where, like, you know, there's the hierarchy within the Catholic Church. The same kind of thing happens with Jews and God-fearing Gentiles, if that makes any, you know. I hope you can see the parallel. Like, it makes sense in my head, but it might not make full sense in yours. Hi, Heavenly Faith. Welcome. You have a question? Sure, I'll take a question now, because we're going to move to chapter 14 soon. But I can take a question now, and then we'll move to chapter 14 after. I'll just drink this while I wait. Chapter 14 is not too long, so it's okay to take a question now. Chapter 15 is pretty long next week, so hopefully next week we don't have... I'll be able to move through that one pretty smoothly, because chapter 15 is super long. It's almost enough to be its own stream, but I'm going to do chapter 15 and 16 next week. That's going to be pretty hardcore. Because once again, chapter 15 is almost long enough to be its own stream. There's a lot of content in that chapter. But we can power through. But chapter 14, the other chapter we're reading today, is pretty short, so we'll be able to move through the rest of this pretty quickly. Have you read Josephus's writings on Jewish antiquities? Someone is questioning its authenticity of it, claiming Christian forgery. I read that more variants were discovered to prove the same writings. Okay, so to answer the first question, not to sound like a dick, but have you watched my streams? I quote this guy all the freaking time. Josephus's writings are very important because one big reason is because, and I mentioned this in the book when I did my Book of Luke readings, and in the very first readings of the Book of Acts. I quote this guy all the freaking time. But basically, what makes Josephus's writings important to Christians is that, you get those critics against Christianity who you can tell they haven't done their research when they make the claim that, like, can you really prove the stuff in the Bible like happened and stuff like that? It's like Josephus verifies basically everything in the New Testament. So even though the thing about Josephus, what makes it important is that he wasn't a Christian talking about Christians. And so it's the analogy that people use is that, let's say you want someone to, like, okay, if I were to learn something about you, Heavenly Faith, for example, who would be the best person for me to get information of you about? So the simple answer would be, actually, the best person to get information of you about would actually be someone that was your enemy. Because let's say I went up to your mom and asked your mom to tell me about you. Well, your mom is going to give me all kinds of biases because your mom likes you, right? So your mom, if I asked your mom to tell me about you, your mom would give me all kinds of biases to paint you in a very positive light, which, you can kind of make that parallel with, like, the Bible and its own beliefs, right? The Bible would obviously paint its own beliefs in a very good light, obviously. So maybe if I want a more accurate description, I would go to someone that hated your guts, and if someone who hated your guts said, I freaking hate that Heavenly Faith guy, but I can't deny that he's actually a really nice guy. I just hate his guts. I think he's a jackass, but at the same time, he helps, he helps people that are in need. He's nice to women, I hate Heavenly Faith, but he's actually really a nice guy. Like, I would actually trust that. I would actually trust that information. Because if for him to speak positively about you despite hating you, that would prove to be reliable information. And so in the case of Josephus, it kind of behaves that way. And actually that's true with Samole Pines. It's the idea that, like, well, these are not people who would normally favor Christianity, but if they still can talk about it accurately and basically can kind of line up a lot of the stuff that the Bible itself says about Christians, then you can trust his information. And so in that kind of vein, like, Josephus is actually someone that many Christians should read, because it's a way of not just, like, and I talk about this all the time on the channel, where one of the things that I criticize other Christians about is that many Christians don't utilize information that can help them. Instead, too many Christians rely too much on other Christian biases to try and justify any claim that they have. And skeptics drill the shit out of that. And if you want to avoid that, you would not just rely on information that affirms your beliefs, but you would use other information as well. And so Josephus, he's not the only one. Virgil's another one too. Information from them is a lot more valuable in a way because they were not people that like would speak favorably of, say, the Bible, for example, but despite that, they still do, which gives a lot of validity to what they say. Because then you can make the assumption that even if they're not pro-Bible, the fact that they still speak positively about it, despite not being pro-Bible, it means that the Bible is then very positive if people who do not think it's positive can say it's positive. And so, yeah, of course I've read Josephus. I think he's very important to read. Virgil's another one. But Virgil's like a little bit later, which is why his information is, not as close to the time period. So once again, there's a little bit of like time discrepancy. But I mean, to be fair, Virgil's still pretty close. Once again, we make the whole joke about like Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great's first biography was written like 300 years after he died. So, and we can say that like, oh yeah, he existed, even though like once again, the first biography is 300 years after he died. So, yeah, you use outside sources from the Bible or Christianity and use opposing scholars. Yeah, and you gotta sift through like, okay, and that's how you can also judge like who's objective in their evaluation. This is true with not just the Bible. This is true with basically anything. It's basically true with basically anything. If you want to trust the validity of any information given about something, you go to sources that don't just reaffirm themselves. They question the language Josephus described. Jesus is raised questionably. Jesus is raised questionable. But again, just skepticism and later begging the question. Oh, well, I mean, once again, see, the thing about Josephus trying to like talk about the Jesus thing, what he talks about is basically, once again, many scholars kind of quote this too, is that, okay, one of the issues of how the Bible describes Jesus encountering people is that he went to his followers, obviously. Jesus wouldn't just appear to random ass people and say, hey, I'm that Jesus guy you get killed. I'm back. What's up? Like, he doesn't do that. And so, which, to be fair, that would be consistent with all the writings about him. So, Josephus makes this claim of like, okay, like, something happened that changed these believers. Something happened. And, that's the observation many of modern scholars make about like the earliest believers of Christianity, and thus, many Christian scholar would say, well, this is what validates Christianity in some sense. It's like, okay, Josephus would acknowledge that something happened. Now, he doesn't know exactly because he didn't encounter the risen Jesus. But something happened because the earliest believers, these guys like Peter and them, which he makes records that these guys did exist. But we know that Josephus wrote quite a bit later because by the time he's writing, James, the brother of Jesus, has taken over the church and has effectively become the second pope. And so he's quite a bit later. But he refers to James, the brother of Jesus, and how James, it's known to people like Josephus that James was actually opposed to the idea that Jesus, his half-brother, was the Messiah. James was heavily opposed. And this was no secret to people. But what changed? What led James being someone thinking his half brother was a lunatic to him being the second pope? Like, something must have happened. Because those two, like, to go from one to the other doesn't just happen. Josephus acknowledges Paul. And I talked about this in the chapter 9 stream about how like Paul was a former terrorist. I mean, Josephus doesn't use that language, but you get the idea. He's like, well, Paul was a completely different person. He was their enemy once. What happened? Something clearly happened that changed these people. Which is also why the Bible makes quite a bit of note of these guys. I mean, like with today's reading, we're talking about like Paul is the focus of the book of Acts, starting from chapter 13. Well, why? Why would they be the focus? Well, because they are important aspects to the validity of the claims of Christianity and Jesus rising from the dead. Because people like Paul, to become Christian, like something must have happened. Of course, you know what the Bible tells us, that well, that was the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But from the outsider's perspective, they may not know exactly what it was, but they know, they know that something did in fact happen. Otherwise, what they're seeing doesn't make sense. Oh no, it's a good question about asking about stuff like Josephus too, because I think one of the many Christians give themselves a disservice by not studying these writers, because then you lose out on useful information. So, and once again, this is not just like in regards to the Bible. Another good example is one of the earliest critics of Buddhism. I can't remember his name, but there was a guy who wrote this old Chinese document, and when Buddhism came to China, there was a heavy opposition, and I can't remember the guy's name. You'd have to look it up, but this guy, he was very much in like, no, we can't really accept Buddhism because it turns too much on its head in the Chinese culture. But at the same time, he then acknowledges that like actually the Buddhist teaching is actually pretty good. And it's kind of, it's one of those things where it's like, well, his information, the writer, I can't remember the guy's name, some Chinese philosopher, he was like, his writing is trustworthy, and his writing validates like Buddhism in a sense, and because he would be someone that like, no, he wants to maintain certain Chinese traditionalisms, which is incompatible with Buddhism, but at the same time he acknowledges Buddhism's merits. And so if someone who opposes those merits can say that they're merits, then you can assume that Buddhism has merits. Which is also why Buddhism ended up spreading in China, was because of this philosopher who actually opposed Buddhism. So it's ironic, right? The irony of trying to challenge something, but if you admit that it has good qualities, then it must have good qualities. A little bit of history on how Buddhism entered China, basically. I can't remember the guy's name, though. You'd have to look it up. But that's basically the TLDR of what happened. This was roughly like 200 BC. Because Buddhism was like, what, 300 BC or something like that? 400 BC? I can't remember. Whenever Siddhartha Gautama, why I like merged his name. Siddhartha Gautama basically, came up with Buddhism. It's the same kind of idea that like utilizing information of people who don't exactly speak favorably to an idea, but they can point out its merits. Those people are actually very trustworthy in their writing, because what do they have to gain by admitting that their opponent has merits? What do they have to gain from it? There are contradicting narrations on Pontius' character. In the Bible, he seems to be curious and reasonable, but other Roman writings depict him as the worst tyrannical figure. Well, the Bible also portrays him as a tyrannical figure. He's kind of a jackass. Pontius Pilate is very much a jackass. There is no way of smoothing that over. He was kind of a dickbag that was very self-interested, and only acted that. Okay, so what you're saying with like Pontius being kind of curious and reasonable, so the Bible's explanation of why he kind of behaves this way is because he heard the rumors about him being innocent and didn't want to get in trouble. for killing an innocent person. So he was actually very self-interested. He wasn't like curious because of like, oh no, like I think he is innocent. No, he heard rumors about him being innocent, and Pontius was and Pilate was very aware that the Jewish authorities were jealous of Jesus. That's why he questioned him. He was basically asking him, is it just because these other guys are jealous of you? Because if that's the case, I might just let you go because you're not worth my time. And so, in actuality, if you actually read Jesus and Pilate's encounter with each other, yeah, the Sanhedrin. If you actually read the dialogue between them closely, this is more clear in the Book of John version, actually. Or sorry, no, this is actually more clear in the Book of Matthew version. I think the problem where you mentioned where like Pontius seems more curious and reasonable, that's because the Book of John has that whole thing about the what is truth thing. But if you actually read according to like Matthew and Luke, and you get a more clear-cut idea of what Pontius Pilate was actually like. If you read Matthew, you can tell he's a jackass. Like he's very self-interested, and everything Pontius Pilate says in the Book of Matthew is very self-serving. Everything is about him not do. He basically doesn't want to do the wrong thing to save his ass. That's the entirety of how he behaves. There is nothing about him that's like nice to Jesus in that story. Hell, even when he thinks Jesus is innocent, he still gets him flogged. So like, in what universe is that him being a nice guy? But in if you read the Matthew and Luke version, I think the misconception comes because in the Book of John version of Jesus and Pontius Pilate talking, there's that whole thing about like the what is truth. So Jesus talks about like, well, you know, well, Pontius first asks, oh, are you the king of the Jews? And then Jesus says, well, you say so. And, you know, Pontius Pilate then goes, you know, I have the authority over your life and death. And then Jesus says, your authority is given to you by God. That is the truth. And then Pontius then asks, what is truth? And then there's that whole philosophical aspect to them. Only the Book of John has this, and I know some people criticize the Book of John for kind of deviating from how we would understand Pontius normally in like Matthew and Luke, where, you know, once again, in Matthew and Luke, Pontius Pilate is very political in his actions. Everything is very political, and basically everything is just to make sure he doesn't get himself in trouble. So, and you know, and this is where when I did the Book of Luke reading, I mentioned that like I was very sympathetic toward Pontius Pilate, even though he is kind of a jackass in the story. But at the same time, you know, if you were in his position, you would do whatever you could to not get yourself in trouble. And I think that's reasonable. So on the one hand, Pontius Pilate, he's not a nice guy, but on the other hand, I sympathize with him because if I were in his position, I'd do the same thing. I would do whatever I could to protect myself. And so, the thing you mentioned before is like, see, in your earlier comment about like there are contradicting narrations, that contradiction appears because John does deviate a little bit from how Pontius would like. Think of it this way: the contradiction appears because Matthew and Luke focus on the political aspect of Jesus' execution. John focuses on a philosophical part of Jesus' execution and the ethics of it, if that makes sense. So John is about ethics. Matthew and Luke talk politics. Those are not the same. They are very different things. Ethics and politics are two very different things. So if you have to talk about a guy using those two things, you're going to get very different images of a person. So that's the simple answer to why there appears to be a contradiction, but it's more of a perspective of what is actually being talked about, politics or ethics. Because once again, if you look at it politically, well, is that why the Sanhedrin threatened Pontius with Caesar's approval? That is exactly why they threatened him with Caesar's approval. The whole thing was political. The whole thing was political. This is where someone like Ben Shapiro, like a hardcore Jewish person, is correct to acknowledge the very political aspect of Jesus, of being a very political figure, because he is. He's that too. And so, when you read the Matthew and Luke accounts of Jesus and Pontius Pilate, you have to look at it through that You have to look through that political lens. But in the book of John is not interested in the political lens. The book of John is interested in the philosophical and, by extension, the theological ethics of Jesus' life. Whereas Matthew is interested in the prophetic aspect of Jesus' life, how he fulfills prophecy, and Luke fulfills the political aspects of Jesus' life. Which I also talk about in the Luke writing, because that's why I said, as I read through the book of Luke, of course it would be very political, because a lot of Luke's writings about Jesus were about how Jesus stirred up political turmoil among the Jewish people, which is what led to the battle larger with Roman political world. Because Jesus' message of salvation was grinding against the Jewish perspective on political relations with not just each other, but how the Jewish people would politically behave while being under Roman rule. And the book of Luke is very interested in that. And that's why when I did the book of Luke readings, you could tell that you can't help but talk about political things while reading the book of Luke, because that is the nature of the book of Luke. It is meant to be very political. So is the book of Acts. The book of Acts is also very political. At least the first part is, anyway. Which I also talked about in my earlier streams, that the early parts of Christianity being a movement was very political. But what Christianity wanted to do to break itself from just being like a political thing was to try and make a cultural movement to shift the way people thought. Which, to an extent, they succeed. And we will read more about that as you go through the book of Acts, and when Paul talks to Gentiles, you kind of see that more. Where in the Jewish context, I think something that's lost in the Jewish context is, as I mentioned many a times already, since Christianity was first viewed as like some Jewish cult, that was kind of all they were treated as. It was just like, oh, they're just some little culty group, whatever, right? Who gives a shit what these guys think? This is what, the Jewish authorities would think. It's like, who gives a shit what these guys think? But then, as Christianity grew, and then it expanded to the Gentile world, it was unavoidable that Christianity would become extremely political. And then, of course, we won't cover it in the book of Acts, but when you get to some of the Pauline epistles, there's so much political stuff in the Pauline epistles, because at that point, there was the messages of the gospel was really grinding against how people lived politically. Which, if I want to make your hot take of the week, just like it was back then, it is no different today. The messages of the gospel will always grind against modern politics. It is no different today than it was back then. And I even use the illustration, I've got to bring this illustration up again, like I did 2 weeks ago with the whole, when I talked about a little bit of history of Christianity in Japan, and why there was so many conflicts with Christians and feudal Japanese, was because of the political conflicts that it caused naturally in the message of the gospel, that, Jesus is king and Jesus is God. But then in Japanese politics, it was, no, the emperor is God. So
you know, something's got to give, and so that's where, you know, you get the political head bashing. And it was no different. It's no it, and that is always something that Christianity will run into, because Christianity is all about the eroding of, and you know, you missed it earlier in the stream. I went into this in great detail, so I'm not going to go in great detail now. You can watch the restream later or something. But basically, Christianity will always erode against what I call ethno-binding uh, religious ideas. And so naturally, that is also in a sense, that is a very political thing, to erode against a ethno binding identity, because of course the whole thing about Christianity is that, like, well, we are all united by, as human beings, under the need of a savior, and that person is Jesus Christ. And so we are all equal. That's where Christians get the idea that we're equal, because we're all human that need the same thing from God: forgiveness. You're trying to be a Saint Jerome scholar. Well, I don't know about that. Saint Jerome was an interesting character, you know. I mean, to be fair, you know, if anyone's like Saint Jerome, I'm kind of like him, you know, kind of out there. Oh, I mean, I make no secret that I'm a little bit out there, but at the same time, and in my mind anyway, and you know, I take it with a grain of salt. I think me being out there in some of the things I think is more born from my frustration with Christians not engaging enough, if you will. So, you know, I am the other end of the. I am the definition of a fanatic. Why lie about it? But in all seriousness, um, it's one of those things that, like, as something that Christians must always avoid is getting too comfortable, because then you lose out on how to really engage with the natural tensions that Christianity really brings about. Is it true that Jesus was sorry? Is it true that Jews were executed by Romans to sacrifice to their gods, and the Jews sacrificed and prayed to the Roman emperors in their temple? Yeah, more or less. I mean, maybe not to that extreme of like human sacrificing, but like in the same way where, like, how do I put this? So in Roman culture, and this is, you know, this is different places have their own version of this. So it's not just Romans that do this shit. So the idea is that, like, you know, contrary to the stuff I talked about, where like most groups tend to do this whole like ethno-binding religious idea, and so the idea is that religion is tied close to a national identity. And when the Romans took over the world, basically, they were like, okay, everybody's going to worship the way we do, because it shows how awesome and shit we Romans are. If everybody worships the same gods as we do, it, you know, that would prove how awesome we are. And so Romans, being Romans and brutal and all that, they would be like, this is not up for debate. You will worship the way we do. And so there were many a people, not just Jews, by the way, many a people that would be forced to conform to what the Romans worshipped. And a big part of that was what we call the emperor cult. Once again, is this whole idea that, like, the emperor is God. And so, I mean, that even exists in our, even to the modern world. I mean, we have 2 months named after two emperors, July and August. And so, you know, that kind of, that was, and it's not just the Romans that did this, right? Every conquering nation does this to an extent. This is the very same idea that many people that are like anti-colonialists complain about, like when the Europeans brought Christianity over. It's the exact same thing. People do this because people have this twisted sense of like, well, if I can make people worship the things I worship, it makes me and my religion look awesome. And so I'm going to make people worship what I worship. The Romans did this. The You know, the colonizing English people did it. The Spanish did it. The Chinese did it. The Arab world did it. The Muslim world did it, more accurately. Everybody who's been a conqueror has done it. It is just, unfortunately, just a part of human psychology that they do. Everybody does it. Everybody, to an extent, does it. It is the mindset of the conqueror. So, when you ask that question, is it true that Jews were executed by Romans to sacrifice to their gods? Maybe not to that extreme, but there was no doubt that many Jews were forced to convert or die, basically, because every conqueror has done that to people. Unfortunately, it's unfortunately just the way human history is. Which once again goes to that Christian idea that, like, all of us are humans in need of forgiveness. That is the appeal Christianity makes. We are all in need of, we are all humans. We are all the same, no matter what culture, time period you come from. We are all the same in the sense that we are all fallen human beings who need forgiveness. Because we would all, and here's the thing, like, oh, is it true that Jews were excused by Romans to sacrifice to their God? No. Once again, they would have tried to they would have tried to make them worship the same things they did. It's also why there was so much turmoil with, like, going back to the Pontius Pilate thing. It's why, like, Pontius Pilate had, like, as much political turmoil as he did, because I mean, you got, like, this is where I sympathize with the guy too. It's like, dude, his job sucked. Being a governor of a group of people that, like, no, F you Romans and your Roman state. Eat my ass. And so, like, you know, you gotta work with these people, you're like, God, I hate my job. That's basically what Pontius Pilate thought every day, probably. And so it was because, of course, in Jerusalem they were very rebellious. They were very like, no, we don't want to worship your gods. We're gonna keep doing things the way we've always done it because we want to maintain our Jewish identity. And that adds on to the whole, like, why the Messiah thing was a big deal, right? Not just with Jesus, but there were many people claiming to be the Messiah because the Jews were really like, when is the Messiah going to come and rid us of these goddamn Romans so that we can be free of this shitty living? That's what the Jews were thinking. That's what they were thinking. And, you know, Jesus turns this on his head that, once again, it's not about just freedom from other human beings, but freedom from the scariest enemy, yourself and your sin. And so, you know, once again, it goes back to, like, the Pontius Pilate thing and why his job was so terrible and why he was extremely careful in how he played his political cards, because he did not want to get screwed over. And that's where I said, like, in that stream when I talked about Pontius Pilate in great detail, I talked about, like, I totally sympathize with him. I get it. I get it. That makes his behavior, even though he's kind of a tyrannical douche, understandable and very relatable. If it was you, you would do the exact same thing, because you would do whatever you could to avoid the same troubles that he did, that he was in risk of running into. You would do whatever you could. And so that's kind of a, I mean, just go rewatch that stream in the book of Luke where I talk about that. Oh, if only it were that easy to just leave on vacation, dude. If only it were that easy. But you know you're gonna get so much political shit, just like Justin Trudeau did when the COVID thing happened, and he was just like, nope, someone else's problem, and goes on a, like, couple week vacation, and then everyone made fun of him because his wife got COVID, and so it's like, karma, bitch. So if only it were that easy to go on vacation, but if you thought that way, it would come bite you in the ass. Justin Trudeau learned that the hard way. Oof! But anyway, I think that's enough fun of, you know, talking politics and stuff like that. Or Ted Cruz, yeah, same thing, right? They just thought, oh, I could just run away from my problems. No, you can't. Ted Cruz, the exact same thing for you Americans. But I remember the whole like Justin Trudeau thing in Canada because I live in Canada, and everyone made fun of him about the whole like he went on vacation as soon as the crisis started, and then his wife got COVID, and so it was like a moment of instant karma. Oof. But Ted Cruz, same kind of thing happened. Right? Tried to run away. You can't run away from your problems. And that's even more so when you're a high political figure. You cannot run away from, you cannot run away from problems. Oh, and then the whole Jews sacrifice and pray to the Roman emperors in their temple. Maybe not in the temple. You'd be executed for that shit. Because the temple was viewed as like a sacred place. Although, to be fair, it had a barracks outside of it, so who knows, right? Anyway, let's read through chapter 14. Chapter 14 is not that long, so we'll get through it pretty quick. And there's really not much to talk about in chapter 14, because I kind of talked about a lot of that in the chapter 13 stuff, about how the shift of Christianity's influence was really able to engage with Gentiles. And I've talked about that in great length already. So chapter 14, as we read through it, you're just going to see more of this. And this is going to be kind of like a huge running kind of theme, if you will. No, that's not the best word for it. But it's kind of like, it's just a relatively common, not common occurrence, but it is the occurrence that happens throughout this saga of the Book of Acts, and how Paul's missionary trip embodies the beginning, if you will, of engaging with the Gentile world, something that was always part of the Christian mandate, but they hadn't really started getting around to until quite some years later. Because as I mentioned before, there's actually a huge time jump that the Bible in the Book of Acts doesn't actually tell you happened. But if you read through the Book of Galatians, Paul talks about a massive ass time jump that happens. I think it's like 14 years he mentions in Galatians 2 or something, about how Paul, after he became a Christian, he was in hiding basically, and he went under some like deep religious training and theological training and stuff like that for 14 years. And then he goes to Jerusalem, meets Peter, which we get that part in the Book of Acts. So between Paul's conversion and then Paul meeting Peter, I think it's like in chapter 9, that's a 14-year time jump. And then we have a couple more years, because Paul then spends all this time in Antioch with Barnabas as they help the church there. And so when you include that time jump, like, it's when Christianity first started as a movement, so like roughly 20 years, between like, what are we in chapter 14 now, and chapter 2 when Peter gives his first sermon, we have like almost 20 years, let's say 20 years, give or take a couple of years, basically 20 years. And so back when Peter gave his first sermon, the Holy Spirit comes and God will make himself known to the world. Well, now and to be fair, 20 years in the ancient world, that's considered fast, even though like by today's standards that'd be really slow for something to move. But hey, 20 years has passed, and now Christianity is moving to the Gentiles, as Peter said in Acts 2. This is going to happen. God is going to do this. And how's he going to do it? Well, he's going to have guys like Paul share the gospel and be very successful in his ministry. And so chapter 14 just has some stories about him being pretty successful in different places. All right, here we go. Chapter 14. Now at Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. And there they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. Yeah, get used to hearing that. But the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against their brothers. Get used to that too. So Paul and Barnabas spent considerable time there, speaking boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among both Jews and Gentiles, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. But Paul and his friends found out about it and fled to God. How the hell do you say that? Lyconium. That's how you say it. Lyconium, to the cities of Lystra and Derbe, and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the gospel. Verse 8. Now in Lystra there sat a man who was lame, and he had been this way from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul as he was speaking, and Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had the faith to be healed. And he called out, "Stand up on your feet!" And at that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." So Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates, because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only people like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from those worthless things to the living God, who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go their own way. Yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your heart with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. Then some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. But after the disciples had gathered around him, Paul got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Verse 21. And they preached the gospel in that city and won a large number of disciples. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. "We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God," they said. Paul and Barnabas appointed leaders for them in every church, and with prayer and fasting committed to the Lord, in whom they had put their trust. Now after going through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia, and when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. From Attalia, they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work they had completed. And on arriving there, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they stayed there a long time with the disciples. Yeah, those damn names, right? Anyway, so chapter 14. Like I said, basically it's about like some success stories of like them, Paul and Barnabas doing ministry work and lots of people coming to belief. And in Lystra, they had a little bit of a funky moment where like people were like, "Oh shit, these are the gods! Sacrifice to them!" And then one of the things that's, interesting is the whole, like, why the hell would Paul and Barnabas rip off their clothes in front of these people? But the idea is that, like, in Jewish culture, you usually rip your clothes to show that you're, like, angry. And so, from a mythological standpoint, if the gods were angry, there would be, like, all hell would break loose. Like Zeus would be shooting lightning at people, and the gods would just be wreaking havoc if they were angry. And so the symbolism of Paul and Barnabas ripping their clothes is that they're showing their anger, but at the same time, nothing's happening. And the idea is that, and as Paul says, we're just people, like you. And so there's that interesting, like, Paul and Barnabas are playing along with the mythology, oddly enough, in this story. I think people miss that detail of, when you think about why Paul and Barnabas ripped their clothes, they're actually adhering to ancient mythology, and then they're making a point out of it by saying, see, we're angry, but nothing's happening. So clearly we're not the gods. We're just guys. And so I always found that an interesting, like, thing that a lot of people actually don't notice about that passage. It's like, yeah, Paul and Barnabas ripped their clothes in front of everybody, which would have been a symbol of anger. But then, of course, the irony is that, like, well, no, they're angry, but no one's being struck down with lightning. Nothing's happening. And so, what's up with that? And Paul's like, well, no shit, nothing's happening. We're just guys like you. But then, of course, like, I don't know, I just found that funny where, like, the people think, like, to sacrifice them because they think they're the gods. I think it's actually kind of funny. Because, no one would ever think that, right? I mean, I guess because the miracle happened. And miracles don't happen, ordinary people don't do miracles normally. But it was just one of those funny moments in the story where it's like, I know that, like, a lot of people know that part of the story well, or they know that part of the story where, like, oh yeah, people thought that Paul and Barnabas were gods. It's just a funny moment. I remember learning about that story in Sunday school. I was just like, that's kind of a weird moment, but okay. Because of course we know better that, like, well, Paul and Barnabas are just two guys. They're like anyone else. But of course, to these Gentiles to see miracles happen, I think that's one of the other things that's kind of interesting to think about, is that for so long, the people are just like, they're looking for something, and this is true in the world today. People are looking for something, they're looking for, the unbelievable to happen, because understandably so, we're all so tired with our the state of our lives and the misery that's in our lives as we go through the daily grind, and all this other nonsense happens within that. And so, people are expecting the unexpected to happen, which I guess wouldn't make it unexpected, but you get the idea. And so, in this story in Acts, it does happen in front of the people. Paul, prays for a guy and he's able to walk, and it's just one of those interesting things where, like, people act religiously all of a sudden, and that's something that, like, once again, we see that in the real world. People, people may make the claim, like, oh, we're not religious people, but then when the unexpected happens, we do extremely religious things. But to be fair, that's human nature, and you can't fault people for doing that. That's just, like, built into our psychology, that human beings are religious in that sense. And so when the unexpected does happen, they revert to this tribalistic religion ritual mindset. And it's, on the one hand, it's not a bad thing that people do that, but at the same time, the Christian mandate is that we are to lead them to the right place, and that's what Paul and Barnabas try to do here. But they have little success, apparently, because there were people still trying to, like, sacrifice bulls to them, which is kind of humorous to think about. I wonder what, I remember, like, the comic book, the Bible comic book, was making a joke about this, and Barnabas is just thinking to himself, like, wait, I'm Zeus? And so, like, the it's just one of those things. It's just like I don't know. I find that kind of funny, and I always think about that comic every time I read this story because it's just hilarious. That like the people just like go out of their minds, and then Paul and Barnabas are like, "What's going on here? Like, we're just guys." Like, but I mean, that's how mythology is born anyway, right? Some ordinary people do something extraordinary, and then people turn ridiculous stories out of them. That is how mythology is actually born for the most part. Anyway, then we get another miracle where like, and Paul gets a lot of sweet ass miracles happen. So he gets to heal a dude, he gets to blind a dude in the last chapter. He gets beaten to the point, and then he gets revived. So he gets beaten to a point of death, and then he's revived because he gets stoned, and then everybody thinks he's dead, so he's like beaten pretty badly. And then he like gets up like, oh, I'm fine. But it's one of those funny things too about like ministry stories. How you don't hear it as much today, but like, I mean, there are those weird cases where God does like a kind of out there miracle when like people are doing missionary work. I've heard stories of like missionaries in Africa running into like the weirdest shit, especially when they have to like confront like witch doctors and stuff like that. Like, dude, spiritual battles can get like nuts over there. Doesn't happen so much over here. I cannot tell you that I've like seen a lot of that kind of stuff. I don't see that kind of stuff, but I have friends that have seen that kind of stuff, and in my mind it just feels like it's weird. But if you're more out there and you're doing mission trips across the world, then maybe you see this kind of stuff more often. But the miracle thing is just always like, it's just kind of interesting that like, and of course there's a reason for it, as I mentioned. I probably mentioned this in a past stream, I don't remember which one, but when people ask, well, why don't miracles happen more often, whatever, but it's like, well, the miracles serve a particular purpose. It's just to show people who have not yet come to the faith the authority of God. That's the point of a miracle. And so, oddly enough, when believers are together, you don't expect the crazy miracles to happen because, like, no, we all believe already, so that's kind of unnecessary. But for example, when some people go to like mission trips in parts of Africa and they have to like confront a witch doctor, oh shit, like, that's when you need it. But like, in my day-to-day life, it's not like I need some crazy miracle to happen all the time. Although there are some parts, there are some situations in life that we do wish that they do happen. But what happens in my mindset? Okay, so what about Pentecostalism? Okay, so here's what I think, though, and take this with a grain of salt. See, when we come to faith, though, when we become believers, we are not so focused on the miracles that happen in this life, but rather, since when we come to faith, we are entrusted with and granted the resurrection power of Jesus Christ. And so, the way I look at it is, the miracles in this life don't matter. They really don't. Because we are already entrusted with and given the resurrection. And so, all that weird shit we read in Revelation about like God literally just like mass resurrecting a whole crap ton of people, and then everybody's suddenly at the judgment throne, and then the whole reigning with Christ for 1,000 years and all that stuff. When you come to faith, you are entrusted with that. And so, like, that is a miracle that would downplay any miracle I could see in this life. Think about that. Like the rising of the dead and being a part of that. That would go beyond any miracle I could see in this life. And so, since we have that vision of that time and that miracle, then why would I need miracles in this life? I know that's like a very cynical take as well, to an extent. I know some people, like a Pentecostal, might view me as being kind of cynical when I say it that way. But the fact of the matter is I already know that I'm going to receive the miracle of resurrection, the greatest miracle. So why would I need another miracle when I've already been given the best one that is to come? And so this is also the assurance that, like, for example, I know many I know a guy, and he's gay, and he but he also wants to be like a faithful believer. So there are times where he may slip up at times, but that's just part of life. And the way he says it is, he's come to terms that in this life he'll always have that. And how does Paul say it? Um, how does Paul say it? There'll always be that thorn in his side. And so this friend of mine, he's like, well, I will always struggle with like my homosexuality. And he's like, but I know that God will restore me in the resurrection. And when I heard him say that, it's like, yes, like that's real confidence in the faith of like the resurrection power. Because he's like, my friend, he just concedes that this life, and of course, like him and I are kind of we're anti, what's that word? Um, we're actually anti-therapy in the sense of like those like gay conversion therapy groups where we're both anti those groups because I don't know, those guys are kind of shifty. But my buddy is just like he just conceded that like in this life he will always struggle with it, but of course he's faithful that Jesus will forgive him, and he's confident that in the resurrection life that's when he'll actually be free from it, not in this life. And so it's the way that we view miracles is kind of like I put that in perspective when I view like how I should view miracles, especially like when we think of like wonder, like signs and wonders like this. That well, we already are insured the resurrection, which is a far greater thing than anything else we could receive, and it is the resurrection hope we live for. And I'll tell you. I don't know if you've heard this one, Heavenly. I've obviously talked about this in the past, though. But for instance, something that we wrestle with in my family is that I have a younger brother, and he's been fighting cancer for 3 years now. Something. It's been a while. Might be a little bit longer than that. Let's say 3 years. Safe to say 3 years. I have a younger brother who's been fighting cancer for 3 years, and we we still pray that the Lord will heal his body, but at the same time, we've also conceded as well. Not that you can't pray for it to like maybe God will heal him, but at the same time, we also trust that through his faith, God will give him a new body in the resurrection, and that will be better than anything we have now. So that is always a hope we look forward to. And of course, I also told this in my Valentine's video about how, when people expect miracles as well in this life, you can be a little short-sighted, where it was actually because of my brother's cancer was when I found, basically my wife at this point. I mean, we're not married yet, and we haven't actually set a date because I'm poor. So, but basically, I would not have. I would. The story is that like I knew she was the one when after my brother got cancer, and my parents, they were so stressed out, and I was stressed out, and we were not. We were all like pretty depressed and all that, and she came to my house in a maid suit. And when I answered the door And I looked at her and I said, "Why are you wearing what the hell are you doing? Why am I house wearing a maid suit?" And she said to me with a straight ass face, "If I have to do maid duties, I should look more maidy." And I was just like, oh, like, hindsight is like, dude, that's make her cringe. But that's also how I knew she was the one. And so, in a sense, there was a miracle there. You wouldn't think of it at the time, like, at the time I'm like cringing like mad here. But God can do all kinds of, miracles are not like just the magical healings and stuff like that, right? Miracles can happen in all kinds of ways. Because, at the time I was like in my early 30s, and, at that point your parents are pressuring you like, when you gonna get a girlfriend? But, God can use situations even as terrible as that, one, to reaffirm our faith as a family. And for instance, like, I'll tell you a funny thing too. Before my brother got cancer, dude, you thought I was 20. Dude, 20 was a long ass time ago. I don't want to think about how long ago that was. No, you have not been deceived, because I have never said I was like in my 20s. My ass, you are 8 years old. Unless you meant to say you were 18. But like, if you say you're 8, like, my ass, you're 8 years old. Okay, yeah, whatever. You're 22, so a regular young person on YouTube age. Nothing out of the ordinary about that. But anyway, I'm digressing. So, another thing too that like helps with building in faith too, and how does Joseph say in Genesis 50? The world may intend things for evil, but God uses things for good. I'll tell you a funny thing, like, hashtag terrible Christians, but for most of my life, actually, my parents and I, and my family, we don't pray before we eat. We don't do the typical Christian pray before you eat thing. We actually don't do that. For the longest time, we didn't do that. We only started doing that more recently, after my brother got sick. And so it was one of those weird things with that. And the point I'm getting at is, the way we view miracles. And I think part of, Pentecostals mean well. They talk about like, well, God can do all kinds of miracles in this life. And that's, it's not untrue. But I think the thing many people have a misconception of is it doesn't have to be those like magical healing moments. It doesn't have to be those magical moments where God suddenly makes someone rich or something like that, or blesses them with a good job or whatever. It doesn't have to happen that way. And so, because I could tell you stories about like things that are like I view as much bigger miracles than, say, like a guy's leg being healed. I've told you this story too, where a good buddy of mine named Jamal, his life changing from the life he used to live to becoming a powerful Christian leader, including my mentor. That is a bigger miracle. And I told that story in more depth in part 5 of the Acts series, as I talked about Paul. And my buddy Jamal was kind of in a similar boat, where Paul was a former terrorist become Christian leader. Well, Jamal was a former gangster turned, Christian leader. And so, stuff like that, that, and in my mind, that's a bigger miracle. Like a former gangster, like, dude, Jamal shot up people. Think about that. It's kind of weird, but like, no, it's true. Like, Jamal's like shot up people, like blown holes in people's chests. Like, he was a bad dude. But then through various circumstances, he was led to Christ, and he's changed his life, and now he's a powerful Christian leader and a powerful pastor. And you hear stories about this all the time, right? About people that like gone the craziest things, and then they encounter Jesus and their life completely changes. Well, in my mind, that's a bigger miracle right there, because that's what a miracle is supposed to be doing, leading people to relationship with Him. that's what a miracle should be doing. So in a way, those are real miracles in my mind. They're big. They're more impressive miracles because you don't think a dude who shot holes in other people would change that much. You don't think that. Yeah, And part of this is also like my perspective of like being a security guard, right? Like I've beaten the fuck out of how many people in my life at this point because I was a security guard. But and part of that, like when I was a security guard, I admit, and I talked about this where I in an old podcast about like I I make it no secret. Okay, maybe you haven't heard it, Heavenly, but I make it no secret that like the Streaming Parson podcast or the Streaming Parson account on YouTube was actually kind of made out of like spite at churches because I was a very angry person at the time. It's ironic, but I was a very angry person at the time because I felt like, oh, so many Christians cheated me and whatever and have done me injustice, which is not a thing that which is not a good thing. And I admit that, like, yeah, that there may be parts of that thinking that are clearly wrong, but this what I do here, and not just here, but like also with my buddy Burke and those guys. God is using me to be like a beacon of light for people, and I'm helping people in their spiritual growth, yours included, Heavenly, and so God is doing some kind of miracle here. And so you got to look for the little things that lead people closer to Jesus as the miracle, as opposed to just viewing like the magical healing moments. Like I said, I don't want to, how do I put that? Downplay, when your typical Pentecostal talks about, God doing like real miracles in his life, which he does. He does. I wouldn't deny that. There are people's lives who are results of that. But from how I see things, is that the a miracle is only really a miracle when it's serving its purpose, and that is leading people closer to Jesus. And so it can be all kinds of small things. And so, whether it's something trivial like my family praying more often, to, my mentor, former gangster, shot people up, is a church pastor, like, yeah, though you see the miracles and where people are being led closer to God. That's how you should view miracles anyway. And so every other miracle, and you read that in the book of Acts too. That is how the miracles work, because and once again, not gonna go in a lot of detail because you can watch my older streams about this, but with sorry, brain fart. So earlier in the book of Acts, we get like Peter doing all kinds of cool magic stuff, right? But then you get to chapter 6 in the book of Acts, and then Stephen's martyred. Well, there's no miracle there. What gives? But then the real miracle happens later, where like what? The Coptic church is born. Entire ass town of Samaritans become Christians. So like bigger miracles happen when something that we expect, like God do a miracle here, save Stephen, but he doesn't do it. But then a bigger miracle happens and it empowers a whole bunch of people and leads them to Christ, which I know like some skeptics may be like, well, that's kind of a twisted way of viewing how God works, right? Because a skeptic might throw the objection of like, well, if God wanted people to believe, he would just do miracles all the time. But the objection to that would be, well, eventually people would get jaded to it. And then we would lose motivation to grow a relationship with God if we get jaded to the miracles. And so there's also that element to it too, which I know this sounds, take this with a grain of salt, but that also is how I justify my somewhat cynical take on miracles at times. I won't lie, okay? My take is a little bit cynical. To say it isn't is a lie. So anyway, yeah, your comment is absolutely correct. There were times where Jesus just didn't do miracles because he's like, well, you're not gonna believe anyway, so why bother? No, you're dead right about that. And then there's a story of when I told you the Syrophoenician story on Wednesday. that's an example of that, where the Jews were like, show us a miracle. Jesus was like, nah, I'm not gonna bother. You're not gonna believe. Of course, he used more colorful language and pissed them off with it. You know, the whole no prophet is respected in his hometown thing. And then what does Jesus do? He performs a miracle for some foreigner. Some foreign woman of all people is the person he does perform a miracle for, because she actually does believe. Even though her belief is a little bit warped, she believes at least enough that Jesus does the miracle. And so, yeah, that's a you know, you're absolutely right about that. But you know, it's one of those funny things where like, I and I try not to sugarcoat things, and so that's why like I understand, and I you know, I'm not gonna lie that like I get that my view on miracles can be a little cynical at times. It is. To say otherwise would be a lie. But at the same time, I think that little bit of cynicism is needed when we look at miracles at times, because the last thing you want is to become jaded to it. Because to become jaded to God's graces is actually worse. And if, you know, hot take of the week, that's exactly what has happened to American culture. God had been too good for too long, that people took it for granted, and then basically refuse God because they say, well, why should I grow a relationship with you? You should just give us miracles and feel entitled to God's goodness. And that's why you have people and their audacity to fight against God the way that they do now in our North American culture, and to be so belligerent about it. How did Jordan Peterson say it? It's like revenge against God for the crime of being, after how good God has been, right? So you don't want, that's worse, right? So, you know, I know. Once again, like, take what I say with a grain of salt, because maybe this is me just trying to justify myself, but you know, having a bit of a cynical take on miracles at times can protect you from something worse like that. Grain of sugar, not me, but I'm not the sweet one here. I'm always the more bitter one. But hashtag terrible pastor. But like, in all seriousness, I think that there needs to be that healthy level of cynicism when we think about miracles, because the last thing you want is to become jaded to the point that you become angry with God for being good, which is unfortunately what has happened in North American culture. God has been, in a sense, this, okay, try not to take this in a heretical way, but God has been too good for too long, that people now are angry, are angry about him for being good. But ironically, you know, how does Paul say in the book of Romans? Well, eventually God will just leave people to their devices. And so we'll see how that plays out, right? But at the same time, you know, for us believers, God wants us to remain faithful and to be good to each other. You know, love God, love your neighbor, despite all that. But anyway, I think that's enough of me rambling. It's about 5:30 now, so I'll just do, you know, I'll take any last minute questions for the last little bit. I will do the housekeeping now though, and then we'll probably end pretty soon after like a question or something, if you have any. So housekeeping. So next week, you know, the problem I've run into as of late is that I haven't found, like, unfortunately, the Song of Conquest project was so short that I'm kind of not sure what to game stream at the moment. There are some options. I might do another attempt at an XCOM Iron Man. That's a possibility. I might do another one in the future. Basically, I don't want to do like a full project, because I am waiting to do something in the beginning of August. I mean, let's be real. You guys know who you're talking to. You can probably figure out what I'm planning for August. But basically, I don't want to do any big projects before that. I want to, you know, be more casual. So we'll see. what I end up doing for game streams next week, because I'm actually not sure. I don't want to keep doing Dead by Daylight like I did the last couple weeks. So we'll see what I end up doing. There are a few small things we could do. I might do an XCOM Iron Man in the near future, just another attempt. We could always dick around in some Heroes Might Magic. That's always an option. Small things like that. We wouldn't do anything like big before August. So, with that being said, though, that's kind of why like my game streams have kind of been all over the place because I'm not 100% sure what I want to do right now. So next week, I'm not like okay. So Monday, I'm not sure I'm gonna stream. I'll just tell you that I don't know. Wednesday, I will do something. I don't know what I'm doing for it, but I'll have content up for Wednesday, and then I'll just kind of screw around in some game or something like that. And then, yeah. So next week will be pretty simple. So Monday is a maybe, and then Wednesday we'll do something, some gaming stream, probably something a lot simpler. And then, of course, next Friday we will continue our Book of Acts reading with chapters 15 and 16. And boy, howdy, get ready for next week, because like I don't know if I'm gonna do chapters 15 and 16, because chapter 15 is almost enough to be its own stream. Because chapter 15 has a lot of content, but we'll see. Basically, for sure, chapter 15 next Friday, maybe chapter 16 as well. Because it's one of those weird things where like chapter 16 is not that long, but chapter 15 is almost like its own stream. So we will see what we do for next Friday. So that's kind of the look for next week. I'll let you know more about the August thing. I mean, once again, it's one of those things that like if you've been around the channel, you kind of already know. Because I've talked about it, but I've never made like an official we're doing it. But you can just assume at this point we're basically doing it. So August is the next big project, so keep your eyes peeled for that. But until then, gaming will kind of be like loose here and there. Maybe I'll do a podcast. I haven't done one of those in a while. So we'll see. On Monday, we'll do like a podcast. If that ends up being the case, I'll obviously stream later. Because game streams I do earlier because I need more time. Whereas like podcasts, I just like ramble about something, not the Bible, for like an hour. So once those are like pretty short, right? So we'll see. Monday is a maybe. And then Wednesday we'll do something. And then Friday we continue our Acts reading. Okay, so you actually have a question. I'm going to read it now. When we die, do we go to Hades first and then heaven or hell? Or Hades first, then resurrected? Seventh-day Adventists believe we just sleep. Okay, so I'm going to clarify the Seventh-day Adventist thing and the whole sleeping thing. When they talk about sleep, they're talking about like a spiritual sleep thing. In a funny twist of irony, I kind of somewhat agree with this spiritual sleep thing that the Seventh-day Adventists they actually believe. It's not like a physical sleep. Obviously, you die. So when you mentioned in your question, one of the possibilities is like Hades and then the resurrection. So the concept. Okay, so I have to clarify the concept of Hades and what that is. So Hades and hell are not the same thing, because hell is hell is a whole bunch of different things actually. So Hades, the concept of Hades, and once again, this was an adaptation based on how people understood, because once again, these are ancient Greeks we're dealing with, and we don't have science fiction to utilize as our good illustrations yet. So is Hades and Sheol. Hell is Hinnon of Valley of Gehenna. So I need to. So this is where I'm going to clarify the mythology of where the idea of Hades comes from. So in the shit, what's it actually called? In the Greek story about like the origin of the Greek gods, and after the gods defeat the Titans, and then like the the six the six children of Kronos have to decide how they're going to divide up the kingdoms of the mortal realm. And so Zeus gets the sky, Poseidon gets the sea, and then Hades gets this like decrepit place that's like in the darkness, if you will. And then, of course, the sisters, the three sisters, one of them gets like the plant life. One of them gets one of them gets like plant life. One of them gets like the animals, basically. And then one of them, well, no, not really the animals, but one of them gets like I guess you say like the living of the world, if you will. And then the other one gets like people. Hera gets people. Zeus gets the sky. Poseidon gets the seas. Hestia gets like the life thingy. Demeter gets like the earth, plant life, and then Hades gets the darkness realm, which is then later understood to be the underworld. And so in this darkness is this idea of where things go to die, this darkness. And so when they talk about Hades being the ruler of this place, and then later when we understand like Hades as the land of the dead, it's this darkness that it's where the, think of it like this way, and we use this English metaphor all the time, where like we talk about how like the light of life leaving is how we describe death. And so that darkness that comes afterward is Hades, if that makes sense. So the English metaphor is, we call life this light, this, the light of life, and when that light fades, you enter the dark state, and that is Hades. And that is understood to be like the realm of the dead. And so, okay, so Sheol, the problem with Sheol and Hinnon is that they're actually real places. And then once again, there's a metaphor behind that. So Sheol goes back to that whole Greek mythology story about like Hades becoming ruler of the underworld. But not so much like the underworld, like underground kind of thing. But it's like a dark cave. And the metaphor is that it's the darkness that becomes you after the light of life leaves you, if that makes sense. So Sheol is this dark cave, this darkness that is described. Whereas Hinnon is a valley where they just burn stuff all the time. And so that's where the imagery of fire comes in with hell a lot. Is that with Hinnon is always like burning stuff. And there's even a story in trying to remember. I don't know whether it was Kings or if it was in Judges, but I did cover it at some point. But there's a story where basically the Israelites are doing really awful things and they're sacrificing children to the god Moloch. And the dead bodies of these children get thrown into the fires of hell, or Hinnon, basically. And this is terrible imagery, right, of like dead children getting thrown into like fire. And that's the idea of hell. But anyway, it's probably in the Book of Kings, now that I think about it more. It's been a while since I've done that reading, okay? So anyway, in the Book of Kings, I think in the Book of Kings, they throw these dead children into this fire, and that's called Hinnon. And that's where the fiery imagery of hell comes in. This imagery returns in the Book of Revelation. This is where once again the imagery of like fire and hell is a lot more solidified. Is because in the Book of Revelation, it talks about how like the dragon and all his followers are thrown into this lake of fire, and the fire never goes out. And there's obviously a close parallel to the Book of Kings and this fire that never seems to go out. This fire from Moloch, supposedly, it never goes out, and that's because humans are really shitty and keep throwing babies in there, basically. like that's how messed up the Israelites were at one point in their history. And that's what happens when you follow false gods. But basically, hell is closely associated with that fiery image. And then the burning lake in Revelation is kind of like an eternal version of that. And so the interesting contrast of why hell is so terrible when you take those two images together of Hinnon, where dead babies are thrown into, dead children more accurately, but you get the idea, dead babies are thrown into. And then the fiery lake in Revelation. Well, in Revelation, the fire never goes out. And that's why it's so terrible. It's like this eternal process. Whereas with this concept of Hades and the realm of the dead, it is merely what happens when the light of life leaves you. So you're actually not wrong when you talk about how Hades and then the resurrected. Because all of us enter that darkness, if you will, when the life of light leaves us. But, you know, the core of the Christian faith is that in Jesus there is the restoration of that life, the resurrection. And so the resurrection brings us all back into the light of, well, ultimately the light of God, which restores all the lights of life in all of us. And so you're not wrong in that interpretation of Hades then to resurrection, because all of us enter the realm of the dead at some point, more or less. And so that's not a wrong way of looking at it. But I will make the statement that like hell and Hades are in fact two very different things. Because the other thing too about like the concept of Hades is that the other thing about like the realm of Hades too, and this is not just in Greek mythology but in every other mythology, is that death is not the end. So once again, like pre-Christian ideas that exist in other religions, but once again, because everybody borrowed from Zoroastrianism, is that death isn't the end. However, since there's no Jesus yet, this other world, everybody is stuck there because there's no way out. And that was the way that people understood the realm of the world of the dead. There's no way out. Of course, the Christian message is that Jesus is the way out because he gives life and life everlasting. He is the way out. But before Jesus, this realm of the dead had no way out. And so every other worldview in mythology understood that there was this place that when you die, you go there and you cannot escape because there is no way out. That is what Hades ultimately was. But in the Christian worldview is that Jesus gives us the light of light again, the light of life again, and thus we can escape it. Or rather, more accurately, Jesus pulls us out of it. But isn't Abraham's bosom part of Hades? That's an interesting question. I actually don't have a good answer to that question. Because many a Bible scholar will talk about how like the bosom of Abraham is a euphemism for being like in the presence of God. But a Jew would never say that outright about like when I die I go to the presence of God. A Jew would never say that outright because it's the whole thing where like, you know, you hear some Christians that you like throw the word like Yahweh, like a Christian would say that, but a Jew would never say that about the name of God. In the same way, the Abraham bosom thing is a euphemism because no Jew would say outright believing in like going to the presence of God. And so that's more of a language thing than anything. So if you understand it from that way, then you would probably say that Abraham's bosom is not part of Hades. But of course, there is that weird ass story in the book of Luke where they can communicate with each other. So maybe it is. I don't know. It's weird like that. And here's the other interesting thing about Hades that's different from like the fiery lake. God actually does show, he actually can appear in Hades. In the story, he does. Which is weird. You wouldn't think that God would end up in this land of darkness. But he does. And so, but in the fiery lake is never described this way. The fiery lake, God's presence is not there. Whereas in Hades, God's presence can be there. As a matter of fact, David refers to a literal Sheol, like a cave. And David even says, well, I cannot escape you even in Sheol. And so this idea is that, once again, this darkness place, well, God can easily travel in and out of it. So there's that weird part too in the book of Psalms. So, the Abraham's bosom being in Sheol, for all we know, it could be, it could not be, and it doesn't really matter. Because apparently God can travel in and out of it as he pleases. So it's the whole like God rewrites all the rules anyway, so it doesn't really matter situation, which I know is not a satisfying answer to some people, but that's just how it is. But yeah, there's that too, and so yeah, Hashem. No self-respecting Jew would actually say that out loud. And so the bosom of Abraham is used as like a euphemism to talk about being in the presence of God. Because the idea is that like in Abraham's bosom, like a place of like comfort is the metaphor that they're going for. Which, I mean, it makes sense, right? To be in someone's arms in this kind of loving embrace. It's the symbol of comfort. Contrast it with the guy, like in that story where you're getting, the story reference of the Abraham bosom thing is the Lazarus and the rich man who die. Lazarus ends up in Abraham's bosom, the rich man ends up in hell, or Sheol, technically. And at the same time, this Sheol also is like hell too, so like kind of weird. The Bible blends them together. But the rich man goes, like, dip your hand in water and put out my tongue to cool my tongue, because it's like, I am in anguish here. And then Abraham goes like, well, I'm sorry, there's this chasm that neither of us can traverse. I guess sound can traverse, but we can't traverse ourselves. But anyway, I'm sorry, I can't help you, buddy. And so of course, and that's where the rich man goes, well, send someone to my family so that they don't end up in this shitty place like I am. And then Abraham goes, well, they have the prophets. Let them hear the words of the prophets, and they will be saved. And then the guy goes, well, what about if someone actually rose from the dead? But the actual way of reading that is, what if someone returned from the land of Sheol? And then Abraham said, well, that wouldn't matter, because some people will not believe. But anyway, there's weird things like that. But anyway, going back to your question, do we go to Hades first, then heaven or hell? Well, once with that in mind, because once again, like, Hades is a metaphorical thing of like being in this darkness that happens when we all must face it. And so, in a sense, I guess we do. If you take like a literal idea of like a land of the dead, because when you're dead, you have to go somewhere. And so I guess that's where we're going. But of course, once again, there is the resurrection. And see, here's the other thing too that I think is a bit of a misconception of like the idea of going directly to heaven or hell. It ignores the resurrection. If you think about it, when people talk about like going to heaven or hell when they die, the way many people describe going to heaven or hell is like a direct skip of the resurrection, which defeats the entirety of Christianity, because Christianity is all about the resurrection. So I am in favor of arguing for like there's a Hades we go to as like a waiting place. Of course, this is where the Catholics twisted a bit with their purgatory mindset. But the part where Catholics get it wrong is the idea that you go to heaven or hell after purgatory, after like a time there. The more accurate way of understanding it is that all of us are stuck in Sheol or Hades or whatever until Jesus says, resurrection time, everybody, time for judgment. Because that's how the book of Revelation describes it. Now, to go back to the Seventh-day Adventist thing, and I kind of have a fun little, I kind of agree with them. If you go like the weird, you gotta humor my weirdness here now. I mean, not like you haven't already been doing that. But here's like a weird thing. And here's a little bit of science fiction too. Like a little science fiction trying to explain parts of the Bible that are hard to understand. So, that sounds scary, time for judgment. Well, it is. Why lie about it? But at the same time, we must all face it. The question is not so much whether we will face it or not. The question is, have we been acquitted? And what will get us acquitted? Of course, for those who have faith in Christ, we know that it is the blood of Jesus that makes us acquitted in judgment. So if you have the blood of Jesus, then you are acquitted in the time of judgment. And so we can face it confidently. But anyway, the whole Seventh-day Adventist thing and the sleep thing, well, here's my funky ass theory about this. So remember I just talked about the whole like being in Hades because of the whole light of life leaving you and being in that state of darkness? Now in my weird mind, and a little bit of science fiction twist, if you will, is that you're actually because you're in this darkness, you're unaware you're in this darkness. Because, I mean, you're in, like, how would you know? So, since there's no way of knowing, you won't be aware that you're there. And so think of it like this. When you die, the next thing you will experience is that resurrection, time for judgment moment. You won't actually be, in my mind anyway, this is once again, this is more my thinking than actual what the Bible teaches. But once again, the Bible is very vague about this, so the theory is fun more than anything. So the Bible never flat out says, if anything occurs between the moment you died and the resurrection. The Bible never actually flat out says anything. The Sheol thing is simply assumed. But what the Seventh-day Adventists are going with the whole sleep thing is that you go from the moment you die to resurrection unaware of everything else that happened in between. So let's hypothetically say you go to the realm of the dead. You wouldn't even be aware this happened. It could have happened. Time skip, exactly. That's exactly what it is. That's the science fiction way of thinking of it. Is like time skip. Because let's put it this way, from your perspective, it's I die and then there's the resurrection. Anything that else happens in between may not be relevant. Because, well, how do you know about the part you weren't there for? And so, like, to you, who just died and then witnessed, the resurrection, from those two moments, may very well be a time skip. Well, not just Paul. A lot of people are going to wake up and be like, what just happened? And that's going to happen to a lot of people. That's how it'll kind of play out from a human perspective, right? That's how you and I will perceive the resurrection. We won't be aware about all this other stuff that happened. Any amount of things could happen, but you and I will be none the wiser. And so from the human perspective, from moment of death to resurrection, it will feel like a time skip. And so the Seventh-day Adventists are kind of right in the whole sleep thing, because of course in sleep you are somewhat aware, so that's not 100% accurate. But the idea that they were going for is that you just go from one thing to another, and the time in between is just a mere sleep, like as if it really mattered, because it ultimately doesn't matter. And that's why we can kind of do the whole time skip joke, because that's kind of, the time skip is kind of just disregards all the other stuff that happens. The time skip disregards anything that could happen in Hades. Those, like, what happens in Hades is completely irrelevant. And so what happens when we die is like, well, it's gonna, I know like when I know the way I said it sounds scary, but you just got to deal with it, because that's how it is. Moment you die, and then Jesus will call us all in the resurrection and say, time for judgment, guys. It's judgment day. And so from our perspective, we may view it as like those two things happen one after another. But in actuality, and this is where the science fiction-y and perspective thing comes in, right? So, let's take our, the first century Christians all dead for 2,000 years almost, right? But they're going to wake up and they won't know 2,000 years happened. They're going to see all these other Christians around and be like, who the heck are all you people? Where'd you all come from? Because to them, they think no time has passed. But we clearly know time has passed. And so obviously there's some kind of time skip there. There is a time dilation. Well, maybe, yeah. That's more of like a brain chemistry thing. But on a spiritual level, it'd be like, well, yeah, and God could do a whole bunch of things between the moment that the light of light left you and then Jesus returning that. A bajillion of things could have happened, and you would be none the wiser. That's how I kind of think that would play out. Because one, it makes sense logically. And it's more consistent with like stuff in Revelation about how the resurrection plays out. So if you actually read in Revelation 19 and 20, more in chapter 20, chapter 19 just kind of starts it. In chapter 20 of Revelation, there's this whole thing where Jesus sets up the new Jerusalem and the new earth. And then when that is done, he then brings out people and then he starts judging them. And so, everybody's in this new ass landscape, which is weird to think about, right? When we all enter the resurrection, every single person, no matter what time period you live in, you're put into a new landscape, this new earth and new Jerusalem thing. And so, once again, the time skip thing makes sense because it doesn't matter when you die. The new landscape is completely different. Completely different because it's the new earth and new Jerusalem. And then Jesus does the whole judging thing, and then those who are acquitted by the blood of Christ are brought into the kingdom, the new Jerusalem, and then everyone else is thrown into the lake of fire. And so the time skip thing makes total sense in my mind because Jesus obviously sets up the new earth and new Jerusalem before he even rose everybody from the dead. Well, then you run into what appears to be a contradiction. Well, wait a minute. If he made a new earth and new Jerusalem, then all the bodies dug in the earth would be gone because the old earth would be gone. So what gives? And so what gives, I guess, would be that he brings everyone into this new world as part of the resurrection. And then there's judgment. And so, well, there's no way you can't say that there isn't some kind of time skip there, even to people who would have died basically just before the New Jerusalem. There's obviously some kind of time skip. So it applies to every single person. So yeah, the time skip is a totally safe assumption to make. And that's me taking kind of like a weird science fiction-y twist on how we would read Revelation 20, because it is a weird passage to read, and anyone who says otherwise doesn't know what they're talking about. It is a weird passage to read, and so that's the way I would read it. And of course, we use science fiction to try and explain how that would work, because in all seriousness, we don't know how that works. That's just a matter of fact. We don't know how that works, but with our imagination, we try and think we can figure out how it works, and that's why science fiction exists. And so maybe that is how it plays out. Maybe, obviously there's more to it than that, but maybe that's the way it plays out. And so what happens when we die is that the things that you do need to know is that like the resurrection must happen. The book of Revelation says it must happen. And then of course there's the whole first resurrection, second resurrection thing, but that's not particularly relevant. What is important is that there is the resurrections, and everybody is brought and then judged. Can't get around that. So, but the resurrection is ultimately what's important. And of course, the heaven and hell thing are just more like heaven and hell themselves are also euphemisms, right? Because heaven is just a euphemism of being in the presence of God. Hell is the euphemism of a place that is not in the presence of God, which is also why I made that differentiation between like hell and Hades, that they're not the same. And the Bible doesn't treat them like they're the same. Because God is not in the burning lake, but he does deliver people from the darkness. So God does traverse in Hades, whereas he does not traverse through hell in that sense. Wacky ass answer to a wacky ass question. And that's how we're going to end it today. But what else is new around here, right? I mean, you're on the Streaming Parson channel. You knew what you signed up for. You knew this is the place where everything weird happens. But that is scary. Well, to say otherwise would be a lie. It is scary, and it's supposed to be. But that's where, you know, what is... I guess that's where you really have to ask the question of, like, do you know where you stand? Kind of thing. Right? And ultimately, the question at the end of the day is, well, are you secure in your relationship with God? Because if you are, then you have nothing to fear. And that's where, you know, I act like a pompous ass at times and say, like, why nothing scares me. Not really. Right? Because at the end of the day, I know that I am secure in Christ and his resurrection. And so, yeah, you know, things like that are. And that's why, like, once again, I'm also not the hugest fan of, like, you are before Jesus staring at you while he asks questions waiting for your answer. Well, there is only one question that God will ask. And it's the same question that Jesus asked Peter. Do you love me? That's going to be the only question that matters. And the only way to prove that is how covered you are in the blood of Christ will be the only thing that can prove that. But anyway, that's its own crazy thing in itself that would obviously be for another, because it's 6 o'clock, dude. Like, I've been answering your one question for like a whole ass half hour here, so but it's, I mean, not that this isn't fun, but I do have to get going. So just a reminder that maybe we'll do something on Monday for streams. Wednesday we will do something, but I don't know what I'm doing yet. The next Friday we will continue our Book of Acts reading in chapter 15, at least chapter 15, and maybe chapter 16. So with that said, this is going to be the end of the stream because it is 6 o'clock. I do need to get going. It is 6 o'clock. So with that said, I hope you guys have a great Friday night. You guys have a great weekend. I'll see you guys next week. God bless you, and take care of yourselves.